A lot for staying with us on Newsnight. I'm Faith Mangope. Now, Zimbabwe's opposition MDC has refused President Emmerson Mnangagwa's invitation for a dialogue. The MDC is demanding that all political prisoners be freed and that the army returns to the barracks. Also of concern in neighboring Zimbabwe is the crumbling economy. Former Finance Minister Tendai Biti believes his country must adopt the South African rand as its currency to restore economic stability. Joins us now in studio for that conversation. Thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this evening.
Good evening, Faith.
Now, you've just flown in from Zimbabwe. I think you landed on Friday. What is happening on the ground? And before we even speak about the MDC's refusal for that dialogue, what is the status in Zimbabwe at present?
Well, since the 12th of January 2019, the situation has been chaotic. We've had a situation where the army has been in townships, beating up people, beating up ordinary citizens. We've had over 1,200 ordinary citizens arrested. Many of them are being subjected to mass trials where they're being sentenced for a length of imprisonment of anything between 4 years to 10 years. We've had vicious attacks on women, including instance of rape, instance of torture. We've had a clampdown on the media, including the closure of internet for almost a week outside the provisions of the law. So you basically have a rogue state, a fascist state that is in charge, and that is playing out fascism in Zimbabwe at the present moment.
So this is what's happening, but then at the back of this, we've got the current president that is calling for a dialogue. In fact, he invited about 23 opposition leaders to engage. The MDC saying no, refusing that invitation. Why is it that there was a refusal of the invitation if he's actually calling for a talk?
Yeah, firstly, let's make it very clear that it was the MDC that has been calling for dialogue long before the election. And our leader, Advocate Nelson Chamisa, has been consistent in appreciating that dialogue is the only mechanism of resolving the current status quo in Zimbabwe.
The president was not the one that was calling for the dialogue, rather the MDC was the one that was calling for the dialogue?
Absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely.
So when that dialogue actually was agreed upon, why the refusal?
It wasn't agreed upon. He unilaterally then invited us for dialogue and gave us something like 24 hours notice. And our position is very clear and simple. For there to be genuine bona fide dialogue, the conditions for a proper dialogue must exist. You cannot have dialogue in a war zone. And Zimbabwe at the present moment is a war zone. So number one, there must be complete demilitarization of the country. The soldiers must go back to the barracks. Number two, all political prisoners must be released and set free. Number three, the political persecution aimed at the complete, entire liquidation of the MDC must stop. We've got over 48 MPs that are on the run. We have got quite a number that have appeared before the courts. Senior leaders of the party, including myself, are undergoing frivolous trials in the courts. That persecution must stop. Number four, there must be a commitment by the regime to uphold the constitution, to uphold human rights. But most importantly, Emmerson Mnangagwa cannot call for this dialogue because at the epicenter of the Zimbabwean crisis is the crisis of legitimacy. Emmerson Mnangagwa did not win the election held on the 30th of July 2018.
So you're saying that the vote was actually rigged?
Absolutely. So only a neutral facilitator appointed by a multilateral institution such as SADC, the African Union, or the UN can call for dialogue in Zimbabwe. And that dialogue must be underwritten by the international community. The perpetrator, the wrongdoer, cannot call for dialogue.
Tenda, I have to ask this. And the question is around, and I hear what you're saying as the MDC. I hear where the standpoint is. My position is, where does the MDC start taking ownership of the country and saying, listen, if this individual who's calling for a dialogue or has created conditions not favorable for a dialogue, then this is our position. This is going to be our stance. Because at the end of it, my concern, and I think even as an ordinary South African or an African for that matter, is that the people that are most suffering here are the ordinary civilians, right? The ordinary civilians Zimbabweans that are fearing the brunt of the economic downturn. No fuel, for example. The teachers, the doctors that have not been paid. That's what's going on the ground right now.
That is why, long before the election, we called for dialogue, because we knew that the election, a one-day event taking place in July of 2018, was not going to be enough to resolve the multiple challenges that are arresting our country. This country, since its establishment as a modern state, has never been more fragile, has never been more vulnerable. And the ordinary average person has never suffered the way he is. For the ordinary average African, his condition and fate right now is worse off than it was in 1952.
Was it worse off? Okay, so is it worse off than it was right now as compared to when Robert Mugabe was the president?
By far. Emmerson is, no Zimbabwean ever thought he would utter the words that Mugabe was better. But the ordinary average person will tell you that Mugabe was better.
You're saying now that Robert Mugabe was a better leader as opposed to Emmerson Mnangagwa?
Emmerson is essentially a fascist. But let me just touch on the economy. On the 1st of October 2018, Mnangagwa's new Minister of Finance imposed a 2% transaction tax on mobile transaction, which is very sadistic, because remember, it was the government itself which literally stole people's money in banks by running an overdraft facility with the central bank. So cash disappeared. So we were then forced to use alternative means of transactions, in particular mobile phone transactions, which we call EcoCash, in particular telegraphic bank transfers, which we call RTGS. The regime then follows us and imposes an onerous 2% tax. On the 12th of January 2019, Emmerson Mnangagwa himself, in his capacity, in his claimed capacity as president, imposes a 300% fuel increase, now making Zimbabwe's fuel the most expensive in the world.
So then are you proposing this proposal that Zimbabwe should be adopting the South African rand as a form of currency? Has it been well thought out? How do you see it being adopted? Do you think that the current president would actually heed that call and listen to that call? What are your views on that?
Firstly, as long as ZANU-PF is in charge, and as long as the fundamentals have not been altered, you can introduce the rand in Zimbabwe tomorrow. The British pound, the euro, it doesn't change anything. The same government bastardized the original Zimbabwean dollar, bastardized what we call the bearer check, bastardized the regime of multiple currency, including the US dollar and the rand that I introduced in 2009. So it's no longer about currency, it's about the management of the economy. The first thing that needs to be addressed is the issue of deficit financing. They've been running a budget deficit that is now 15% of GDP. So we need fiscal consolidation. What I used to call, when I was Minister of Finance, we eat what we kill. If we kill 2 cents, we spend 2 cents. ZANU suffers from a disease that I call fiscalitis, which is the diseases of just spending money oblivious that of where it's coming from. Spending money as if it grows on trees. Secondly, we need to deal with the distortions that they've created. One of them is the crazy distortion that our own currency, our fiat currency, the bond note and the RTGS is equal and on par with the US dollar. Not even the rand coming from South Africa, a $400 billion US dollar economy, is equal to the US dollar.
We need to seriously have more time to actually continue this conversation. I have to wrap you right now, but I think that the one thing that you've made quite clear is that you're not having a meeting and a dialogue with the president unless there's a third party involved, and that is from a multilateral
and the conditions
and also the conditions that must be favorable for that dialogue to take place, and that includes the disarming of the military there. We have to leave our conversation there, Minister, but hopefully that you get to join us again in our studio and really shed some light in terms of what's going on in Zimbabwe there. Well, on Newsnight, that was the former finance minister of Zimbabwe, Minister Tendai Biti, as he conversates with us around what is happening with Zimbabwe at the moment. Well, when Newsnight continues,